Someone plays carnival music in our yard late at night. Plus, all updates. This is going to sound bizarre and made up, but I swear on my left nipple that this happened and there are several witnesses, even if I can't explain why someone would do this. I am fairly positive this isn't anything paranormal. I live quite a distance off the road in an unremarkable house on private property. My neighbors are all older family members who go to bed extremely early and whose children are already grown and out of the house. In summary, there are no mischief makers to play pranks on us here. A few months ago, my mother and I stayed up late one evening watching television together. Around AM, I turned the television off and decided to go to bed. As I was leaving the room, I began to hear what sounded like carnival music playing outside of my house in the front yard. It was loud and close. My mother heard it too, and immediately went to the window to investigate. She couldn't see anything but darkness. Everyone else was either asleep for the night or away on vacation. The lights were off in all their houses, and none of them would be caught dead listening to anything but country music anyway. We were miles from the nearest city, so it wasn't the product of noise pollution. You can hear when a car has pulled up in the yard, but there was no sound of a car. The silence where we live is usually deafening. All you can hear is the ringing in your ears. Where did this song come from? Who was playing it? And why? I was very unsettled by the idea of a stranger in our yard playing carnival music, as such suggests malicious intent. My father and uncle later mentioned that, 20 years ago, when my parents first moved in, the electrician had come to install a ceiling light and stopped in the middle of his work, saying he could hear Pink Floyd playing in the front yard. Neither my father nor uncle could hear it. My father is a bit hard of hearing, and my uncle is much older, so they laughed it off and thought the man was insane. But the electrician was freaked out. He kept opening the door and trying to find the source of the noise to no avail. Then, it hit me. The song I had heard that night was Pink Floyd's Cirrus Minor, the part that sounds like carnival music. I played the song for my mother, and she began freaking out saying, "Yes, yes, that's what I heard. Who the hell sits in my yard at night at AM in the middle of nowhere playing the same song, which isn't even a popular song, 20 years later with no car? Where did they come from? They would have had to have walked several miles to get here." Aside from this, the only other strange thing we experience that would suggest an intruder, we feel and hear knocking on the living room window late at night around the same hour, sometimes so intense that the entire wall of the house is rattled and it sends the couch against it into a reclining position. There are no nearby trees to trap the glass, and no animal except a human could possibly reach it. Fortunately, this has stopped over the last few weeks. Update. This is an update on the situation, as many people have requested. Shortly after my first post, I had almost convinced myself our intruder was gone when, as I was staying up into the early hours of the morning to finish a bit of homework, I heard a noise in the yard just outside my bedroom. I sat there listening, but could only detect something like machinery. It was not a sound that I recognized. I couldn't imagine what was causing the noise unless the air conditioner was misbehaving. But once it had quieted down, I finished working and went to sleep. About 2 nights later, I heard loud grinding around the same hour, but again could not determine the source, however alarming the volume was. The following morning, my father discovered someone had sabotaged our air conditioning unit by first removing a piece of its inner machinery and later throwing it into the fan while it was spinning, effectively destroying its blades and a few other pieces. The part had presumably been taken the first time and was disturbed by activity in the yard and thrown back in the second time. I had noticed it only because the outdoor unit is mounted against my bedroom. We thought initially that the piece, and forgive me for the ambiguous language, as I am not very technology savvy, had loosened by itself and broken down, but we called our repairman, who begged to differ. He was surprised by the degree of damage and insisted he had never seen it happen naturally, suspecting someone had removed several screws and tampered with the unit. He thought my father had attempted to work on it and caused the trouble, but of course, he had not. A few days after the damaged parts had been fully replaced, My mother was leaving for a doctor's appointment when she began yelling and called the family into the yard. Our electric box was opened in the night and left ajar, as if someone had been trying to find a wire to cut our electricity or disable a suspected indoor security system. We had been outside several times since the repairman finished his work, and we are certain he closed the electric box, if he ever even opened it. We have weathered several severe hurricanes here, and winds are not strong enough to open our electric box. A person had to have done it. Weeks passed without incident, my parents opting to overlook these concerning happenings. My father tried to explain the air conditioner as a freak occurrence. They purchased a new gun and did little else. Towards the beginning of the summer, my grandfather mentioned that, a couple weeks prior, when we were on vacation, he'd seen a red Jeep drive the lengthy distance from the road through our private property to our house in broad daylight. He didn't recognize the driver, but approached and questioned him. The man claimed he was looking for a woman that lived in a trailer. The person he claimed he was looking for had the name of a family friend that lives hours away from us. The man was behaving strangely, and my grandfather was not convinced by his story. He ordered him to leave immediately. Our family that lives around us on the farm is reinforcing their doors, installing extra locks, and keeping their children out of their yards until we find out what's going on. They won't even let them walk home from the bus stop anymore. I had stopped worrying over it as much because I've been preoccupied with moving to a new state. But the old knocking returned this evening at p.m. My parents were watching television together when they heard it. They turned on the porch light and peered out the peephole of the back door to investigate, but saw no one. At a.m., I was awake watching television when it sounded as if someone forcefully punched the glass of the usual exposed window. I covered it with a blanket, as I always do. An hour after I covered the window, I began to hear loud noises from our back door porch off of the kitchen, as if someone had stepped onto it. However, it was briefly lived. They apparently weren't walking around, but simply standing there. About 10 minutes after, I heard yet more knocking, except this time, it wasn't on the exposed living room window, but further down the wall the window is on, next to the couch. It was 3 knocks, forceful enough to rattle the wall a bit, but not so much the couch moved. This is more alarming, because it suggests the trespasser lingers here for several hours at a time, posing many questions. Are we being watched for an opportunity to force entry? Hasn't the opportunity already arisen in the past, and they never took it? Are we being stalked? Do they gather here to drink and get high on the property and then decide, in their stupor, it will be funny to antagonize us? Why is it only our house that is targeted, and not the other houses on the farm? Why do they walk several miles to come here? Their behavior is escalating. Will they eventually take things further? I woke my mother and we sat awake together until the sun rose to keep watch. We compiled a list of happenings here that suggest our trespasser visits more frequently than they knock. Despite no one in the family smoking, and anyone who does smoke living too far away for us to smell it, we often deal with the strong scent of a cigarette around windows or the front and back doors of the house. This happens at our bedroom windows with alarming regularity. Other times, it's strange cologne or a chemical stench, like a fresh perm. We of course remembered how my aunt's dogs will bark intensely at odd hours of the night, like they do when a stranger visits, and the motion detecting yard light has previously come on when no one is home at my grandfather's. My mother and I are going to walk around the perimeter of the house in the morning to look for cigarette butts, and we'll try convincing my father we at least need security cameras outside, even though I think we should involve the police at this point. He's been too indifferent to everything that has happened, and it makes it challenging to be proactive about our safety. Final update. I have previously made 2 posts about a person that visits our yard late at night in the early hours of the morning to harass us. They stand on the porch, tamper with our outside appliances, beat on the windows, break into our electric box, and repeatedly play an obscure song by Pink Floyd called Cirrus Minor. This has been going on now since before I was born and am currently 21 years old. This is the resolution to that situation. We believe the culprit has been apprehended and arrested. Despite the insistence of myself and other Redditors, my parents never installed security cameras. My father remained resistant to the idea, most likely because he wasn't willing to admit that something was amiss. In the beginning, he complained about the cost, the possibility of hackers, and the difficulties with mounting a camera. He eventually promised to borrow someone's trail camera, but he never broached the subject with them. I moved to another state, and the need for the camera was no longer at the forefront of my mind. But when I remembered and received my new debit card after some unfortunate identity theft, I offered to pay for one. I told my father that I would personally buy a camera or two and have them delivered. Only then did he confess that he was afraid of seeing something spooky on it. He had the childlike idea that if he never saw anything happening, the problem would resolve itself. Despite all odds, the problem did resolve it. Not long after I moved out, my grandfather, who lives in a separate house on the same farm, came home to find police cars in his driveway. An officer approached him and asked if he owned another house on the farm, as he needed to speak to the landlord about his tenants. The house in question is occupied by a late relative's widow, who has a lifetime estate. My grandfather explained that the property is a part of the farm, which is owned collectively by him and his daughters. Because of this, he was permitted knowledge of what happened there. The officer explained everything. Apparently, the widow, who is quite old and infirm, used the death of my relative as an excuse to move in her chronically unemployed, drug-addicted family, among them her daughter, her son-in-law, her son-in-law's brother, and her nephew. Because they don't own their own separate cars, and we seldom visit the widow, she stinks and is generally unlikable. So we social distanced around her before the pandemic ever even began. This transition went undetected. Shortly before my grandfather had returned home that day, the police responded to a 911 call from the widow. Her nephew is apparently involved in a gang and has violent tendencies. Some conflict arose in the household, probably related to how many drug addicts were stuffed together under a single roof for 24 hours a day. All we were told is that the nephew was becoming violent. When the police arrived, they realized there was an outstanding warrant for his arrest. He was wanted for making meth, which, interestingly, commenters on my last post blamed for the stench we had been smelling and for assault. The nephew was hiding from the law at the widow's house. This is the reason his presence was concealed from us on the rare occasions that the widow was outside of her home and we spoke. He was removed from the home and arrested by the officers. Ever since then, there has been no strong chemical odor outside and no knocking on the window late at night. We suspect he was aware of this farm long before moving in, and it was his go-to spot for recreational drug use. The widow is around 80 years old and had her first child at approximately 13 with her first spouse. So her nephew is elderly himself and would have likely been doing drugs and playing his Pink Floyd music here 21 years ago too. We're thinking he would occasionally spend the night at the widow's house over the years and walk towards the fields near us to do drugs. It makes sense that we never heard a car accompanying the knocking noises, because he doesn't own a car, and the house is not far since it's a part of the farm. The only incident that remains unexplained is the man who drove to our house when we weren't home and asked my grandfather about a family friend that lives hours away. I wonder if they were looking for the meth head and were told to give some sort of code to make sure he was at the right house. The name could have just been a coincidence. I had an internet incident a few months that suggested some stalkerish activity, but that is probably unrelated. I apologize for updating you all so late. I am satisfied with this explanation since there has been no repeat occurrences after his arrest. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments.